So tonight we looked at Surah 33. Again, this time we picked up on section 4. So section 4 is a little bit different in its content than the previous sections of the surah that we looked at. Now, to kind of set the context, we had talked in previous studies about the battle against the local Jews that had teamed up with pagans in the Battle of the Trenches. And in the Battle of the Trenches, there were about 10,000 or so non-Muslims versus 3,000 Muslims, and for various reasons, the Muslims emerged victorious. And so this section picks up kind of in the aftermath of that, and it's in the context of this is about the 5th year after the Hijrah. And at this particular point in time, Muhammad and the Muslim community are pretty well off financially. They're doing pretty well. And so what we see in this surah starts out with God giving some commands to Muhammad, but then in the rest of the ayahs in this particular passage, we see Allah giving commands to Muhammad's wives. Now Muhammad had 9 wives, and that's unique in Islam. I believe only Muhammad was allowed that many wives. For the rest of all Muslims, they're allowed to have up to 4 wives. So we see this in Surah 4 and Ayah 3, where it talks about, here I'll quote it exactly. It says, "And if you wish to marry them, and you fear that you will not be able to do justice to the orphan girls, then marry them not, rather marry of women other than these, as may be agreeable to you. You may marry 2 or 3 or 4, provided you do justice to them. But if you fear that you will not be able to deal with all of them equitably, then confine yourselves only to 1. Or you may marry that whom your right hands possess, your female captives of war. That is the best way to avoid doing injustice." So really the long and the short of that is, in Islam, you're allowed to have up to 4 wives, assuming you can provide for them, assuming you can handle 4 wives. And good luck. Most of us can't even handle 1. So, but to have 4 wives is possible as long as you can financially provide for them. But Muhammad was an exception. He had 9 wives, and the greater part of this passage is directed to them. Now, it was good to have this study at the mosque with the imam there, because he was able to kind of set up the historical and theological context of this passage. You'd find out things in this study that you wouldn't find out just simply by reading the text alone. So what we find out here is that despite the wealth that he accumulated, Muhammad, he had a pretty humble background, and he was known to have, at least in his younger years, I'm not really sure if he did this throughout his whole life or not. That wasn't really clear to me, but he did have a humble background. He never ate 3 days in a row. So that doesn't mean he never ate. It just meant that he never ate for 3 consecutive days. He'd always go at least 1 day out of every 3 without eating anything. And he had chosen a state of poverty. So even though he had all this wealth that he had accumulated, and that the Muslim community there had accumulated, he didn't keep very much of that for himself. He kept very little of it for himself, and he divvied it out amongst all the other households. And so what it appears here is that, and there's a couple of different ways that this is interpreted apparently amongst Muslim scholars. But it seems that the wives began to request more money from Muhammad, and they seem to be saying something to the effect of, "Well, we have all this money now, and this is being divvied out amongst all these other families. How come we don't have any of it? I mean, we're the wives of the Holy Prophet. We should have some preeminence or some additional provision." Now, we're not really sure what exactly happened, what exactly went down as far as a conversation, but evidently for whatever reason the wives asked for more provision, and Muhammad supposedly remained silent for several days after this. He wasn't too happy that his wives approached him with this particular request. And so he remained silent for several days, and then he recited this surah. But when he went silent, the wives let him know that, hey, we'd rather be with you and would rather have spiritual truth than to have wealth. Now, another theory here that led up to all this is that Muhammad's wives had some companions that were hypocrites, and we'll see a little bit later down in the passage where it talks about having a spiritual disease. And we talked in one of the earlier videos about the munafiqeen, the hypocrites, and hypocrisy is often associated with having a spiritual kind of disease. So it's possible that the wives of Muhammad had some companions that were like this, that were hypocritical, and they may have brought this on. They may have kind of put a bug in their ear saying, hey, you all are the wives of the prophet, and here you don't have hardly anything. I mean, the funds are there. Why don't you ask for a little bit of it? But we're not really sure what exactly led up to all this. Those are just a couple of different theories, but in any event, this seems to be the surah that responds to that. So I'm going to go through and read through this passage real quick. Now, the first couple of ayahs here are addressing Muhammad himself. So verses 28 and 29 says, O prophet, say to your wives, if you desire the present life and its beautiful things of adornment, come then, I will provide for you worldly provisions and allow you to depart in a handsome manner, a kindly departing. But if you choose the good will of Allah and of this messenger, and in this way prefer the abode of the hereafter, then truly Allah has prepared a great reward for the doers of good among you. Now this is where it switches gears and it addresses Muhammad's wives. O wives of the Prophet, if any of you be guilty of manifest improper conduct, a conduct falling short of the highest standard of faith, as you are made an excellent model for others, you will receive punishment twice over. It is indeed easy for Allah to double your punishment. But whoever of you is obedient to Allah and his messengers and does righteous deeds, we shall give her a reward twice over, and we have prepared for her an honorable provision. O wives of the Prophet, you are like no other women. If you would guard against evil, so be not soft in speech, lest he who carries a disease in his heart, so these are the hypocrites, should feel tempted. And you should speak decent words in a dignified tone, and remain in your houses with grace and dignity. You, being the mothers of the believers, will not be allowed to marry. And do not show yourselves off, as did the women in the bygone days of ignorance, who displayed their finery, and observe prayer, present the zakat, and purifying dues, regularly, and obey Allah and his messenger. Members of the house of the Prophet of God, verily Allah desires to rid you of all uncleanliness and to purify you completely, and keep in mind the messages of Allah and the words of wisdom which are recited in your homes. Verily benign is Allah, all aware. Now, one thing that was interesting that was brought up, if you look at verse 33, it says, remain in your houses with grace and dignity. Apparently this can be easily interpreted to be commanding the wives to just stay in their house and not go out of their house, and this would present a contradiction with another passage in the Quran where you're urged to to go out of your house. So I don't know exactly where that passage is. I didn't hear the Imam say what passage it is, but the Imam claims that this would pose a contradiction if it was interpreted that way. So what it's actually saying is be decent in your homes. It doesn't say, the emphasis is not on remain in your houses. It's saying remain in your houses with grace and dignity. So the emphasis is on grace and dignity, or it can also be translated decency. Be decent in your homes. So this is telling women to adorn themselves modestly, and when they go out in public, they need to have the proper clothing on, they need to be in full hijab and have the cloak on over their regular clothes and things like that that they wear when they go out in public. They need to also have that on when they are in their homes. If they have visitors and things like that, they need to act in such a way and dress and look in such a way as they would conduct themselves out in public as well. So it's not saying stay in your house and don't ever go out. It's saying when you're in your homes, be decent. And so we see this idea of receiving double punishment versus double reward. So it's sort of, I guess, with a great power comes great responsibility type of thing. And I've been watching a lot of Spider-Man lately, so I guess I have Spider-Man on the brain. It's with great power comes great responsibility. But kind of that same concept here, that now that these wives of Muhammad have supposedly asked for greater provision, greater reward, well, like the Bible says, to whom much is given, much will be required, and we see that here. If they if they fall short, according to verse 30, of the highest standard of faith, you will receive punishment, not just punishment, but punishment twice over. And then we see down in verse 31, in the very next verse, it says, "But if you're obedient to Allah and His Messenger and do righteous deeds, you'll receive reward twice over." So there's really no middle ground here. It's either you do what you're supposed to do and get double reward, or you don't, you slack off and you get double punishment. That's how that's going to work. And I would imagine, being the wives of Muhammad, they would have a lot of expectation as far as their conduct. That would bring reproach on Muhammad and reproach on the entire Islam community if his wife were to act and behave in such a way that was unbecoming of what Muhammad was teaching. So there's some discussion here, and a lot of discussion took place tonight about, well, a couple of things. One is divorce, and then one is the concept of zakat. So first of all, divorce, it doesn't explicitly come up a lot here, but I think the insinuation was that when these wives made the request to Muhammad, that he may have considered divorcing them. I'm not really sure, but divorce was talked about quite a bit. And to make a long story short, divorce is heavily looked down upon in Islam. There are certain times or certain circumstances where that's allowable, but it should always be as a last resort, and there's always plenty of time to make up or to reconcile. So if you want to look more into that, what the Quran says about divorce, look at Surah 2, verses 228, I think, up through 230. So right there in that general area is where you get a discussion about divorce and the stipulations and requirements surrounding divorce. So it's kind of like Christianity in the sense that it's not completely ruled out, but it's looked down upon. It's not a desirable state, but it is permissible under certain circumstances. Now on to zakat. So zakat is one of the pillars of Islam. I believe it's the third pillar of Islam, if I'm not mistaken. And zakat literally just means purification. So even if you look at a translation, when you see the word zakat, it'll have purification there in parentheses next to it, I believe. And here in this passage I'm looking at right now, it certainly does. So zakat can mean different things regarding purification, but here it specifically means, and in the third pillar it specifically means purification financially. So there was a lot of discussion tonight on how Muslims should handle their finances, and they actually have a pretty solid view of how you should handle finances. A certain amount should go to tithing, which is what we'll talk about here in a minute. A certain amount should be saved and invested, and that they believe it's wrong for money to ever just sit. If money's just sitting and nothing's being done with it, then you're not using it properly. You're not being a good steward. So it's a pretty healthy approach to finances. They're not against wealth by any means, but they are certainly against the idea of being attached to wealth. So they even mentioned that it's good to have sort of a middle ground, a middle way, and that made me think of Buddhism. And when we get to Buddhism, we'll talk about that, the middle way, just avoiding either extreme. So Muslims do not favor extreme poverty, nor do they favor extreme wealth. And with poverty, it's not that there's anything wrong with being poor. It's just that if you have all this money and you choose to just sit on it, if you choose to live like a poor person and not do anything good with it, then you're not using your money properly. It's okay to have things. It's okay to have wealth. But when you make that money into, I guess what I would call an idol, that's when you're misusing it. That's when you've gone the wrong way and you've just gone too far. So I think they have a pretty healthy view of finances. So it was kind of interesting to hear that discussion. And they actually talked about it for a pretty long time. It was interesting to sit there and listen to and to be a part of. And they even asked me a little bit about what's the Judeo-Christian view. And I talked about tithing, how tithing literally means tenth. And Malachi says to bring all tithes into the storehouse. Christians disagree on what that means. Some Christians don't believe that tithing applies to us today or anything like that, that it was just an Old Testament stipulation. But the majority view of Christians is that the tithe, the tenth of your income, is to go to your local church where you worship. But anyway, so they wanted to know about that, and they were interested in that. So with the zakat, though, it's the purification of finances, and it's the giving of alms. So depending on what passage you read, there are different kinds of zakat for different circumstances, but it can also be utilized as a general term for giving. So it can refer to specific kinds of giving, or it can just refer to giving in general. And I either knew this and forgot, or just never knew it in the first place, but I asked the question and they discussed it at some length, that is there a certain amount, a minimum amount that you're supposed to give in zakat, and it is 2.5%. So 2.5% of your income, of your possessions, and that even means, if you own expensive jewelry or anything like that, you need to give 2.5% of whatever that value is. So that's the minimum. A lot of Muslims, I think, give more, but 2.5% is the minimum. Now, if you have agriculture, if you have crops or anything like that, you're required to give 10%. That also applies to investment or anything like that you didn't earn. So investment or inheritance, things that you acquire that you did not work for, anything that you may have put money into, but then it multiplied. On that, you're required to give 10%. Now, there's no maximum amount to give for zakat. You can give however much, but you must at least give 2.5%. And if it's agriculture or any kind of investment, any kind of growth in your finances, any kind of investment, that needs to be 10%. Another thing they said I thought was interesting was that in Islam, husbands and wives have separate incomes. There's not this idea of the two become one, at least not in a financial sense. So the wife, if she gets a certain inheritance, then that's her money, and she's not obligated to give that to her husband. Now, she is obligated to give zakat on it. So if she gives a $10,000 inheritance, then she owes $1,000 in zakat. Or if she owns a pearl necklace, then she needs to give 2.5% of the value of that necklace. So that I thought was pretty interesting too. So I learned some new stuff tonight, just about the nuts and bolts of Islam and Muslim culture. So it's pretty cool. So, and that's pretty much all that we covered tonight. So, like I said, a lot of discussion around zakat and around divorce. And this idea that, especially with respect to Muhammad's wives, they would be doubly punished if they did not live and behave according to Allah's requirements and stipulations, but that on the other hand, if they did do what they were supposed to do, then they would be doubly blessed. So that's pretty much all I have for tonight. That is, again, Surah 33 and section 4, which is ayahs 28 through 34. So thank you very much for listening, and God bless.